Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sabine Sielke, and as the director of the North American Studies Program and the German-Canadian Center of the University of Bonn, I welcome you to our lecture series, The White House Embattled, the US Election 2020. And I welcome in particular, of course, our first speaker, Dr. Philipp Adolf. Good evening, Dr. Adolf. We're very happy to have you as our opening act.
Well, good evening, and thank you very much for having me, and of course a warm welcome to all of the viewers as well.
Thank you very much. I'm also very pleased that once again our events are a co-production organized in cooperation with the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung and the America House in Cologne, and I thank Christoph Müller-Hochstede and Anna Hoff at the Bundeszentrale and Dr. Benjamin Becker and Katharina Kiesel at the America House for all their support. Just as in previous election years, our focus over the summer is on issues relevant to the current presidential race. And yet these are very special circumstances for both the US election and our lectures. Presenting our series online is a challenge, and I'd much rather interact with our speakers and with you, our audience, face to face. And yet, doing all this at a safe distance also allows us to open up the conversation to those who are not close by. And this is, of course, a very much appreciated side effect. Just a few words on procedures. We will have a short Q&A session at the end, but for now, we have all of you muted. Because we want to allow for a better transmission. And I also would like to point out to you that we're recording our lectures in order to make them accessible afterwards. And this may be the right place to thank our new student assistant, Alexandra Herbst, who has turned into an IT specialist in no time whatsoever. Now, our 11 events with 12 speakers engage the upcoming election from multiple directions and follow a presidential race that unfolds under previously unknown conditions. Before Corona, it may simply have been irritating, at least to some of us, that a re-election of the current commander-in-chief was becoming more and more likely. Meanwhile, the COVID-19 pandemic has newly curtailed the presidential race, and most particularly, of course, the visibility of the Democrats who canceled their primaries in New York today, as I'm sure you heard. Donald Trump, in turn, takes center stage and makes each one of his appearances part and parcel of his re-election campaign. Our goal is to bring back to our attention what keeps moving off our screens and radars during this summer. Our lectures engage issues of race and gender, US-Chinese, as well as transatlantic relations, US foreign policy, Trump and trade, as well as the far field of populism, among other matters. Our full program and more details on individual lectures, as well as how to take part in the events, you can see all of that on our website and on the websites of our cooperation partners. And we, of course, appreciate if you spread the word. And now I'd like to briefly introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Philipp Adolf. Dr. Adolf is a lecturer at our university's Institute for Political Science and Sociology and received both his MA and his PhD from the University of Bonn. As an expert in US politics, he has focused his research on race and other demographic factors, on the Republican Party, as well as on right-wing populism, and lately the politicization of the judiciary in the United States. Philipp Adolf published a book on the Republican Party in the US in 2019 and co-edited 2 essay collections, one on the question whether the US is a failing democracy, which came out in 2019, the other on the consequences of the Brexit for the future of Europe, which was published in 2019. His work on US American and German politics also appears in prominent journals, and he contributes to the Monkey Cage website of the Washington Post as well. Dr. Ador's lecture, Comeback or Continuation, The Relevance of Race in the Trump Era, raises an issue that is highly relevant to an understanding of US American politics in general, and to Joe Biden's success in the primaries in particular, a success Biden owes first and foremost to African American voters. But there's much more to say about the relevance of race in times of Donald Trump, and we're very much looking forward to sharing your insights, Dr. Adolf. The floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction. And once again, thank you as well for putting together this lecture series despite these rather challenging times. Of course, I think moving forward, there are going to be a number of lectures which will in some ways focus more on the coronavirus as well. And at least on the surface, I think some people perhaps in the audience might wonder, race and the coronavirus, does that have anything to do with each other? And most certainly, I think on the surface, it appears that there's no interlinkage or very little interlinkage between race and the coronavirus. But once you delve a bit deeper into the topic, you do see that racial and ethnic minorities, for example, have been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus. If you look at the death rates, if you look at the share of infections, you do see that minority communities have been affected, as I mentioned, disproportionately by it, which of course also has to do with a lack of healthcare coverage and a general sort of lack of an extensive welfare state. And these are two topics that are heavily racialized in public discourse in the United States. At the same time, we also see the polarization in society. If you compare the coronavirus and this epidemic, for example, to 9/11 and the response after 9/11 of the country coming together, it's quite sad to see just how divided society has become over the past close to 2 decades, and how both Republicans and Democrats have reacted to the coronavirus at the elite level and the mass level as well in a different manner. And this polarization is also sort of a result, to a certain extent, of what I'm about to talk about. The racialization of politics, the role that race plays, has driven both parties ever further apart. Of course, what I also want to discuss over the coming 45 to 60 minutes is how the Trump phenomenon has come about. One of the things, or one of the pictures that I came across recently, which I found quite interesting in this context, was from a demonstration in Wisconsin a couple of days ago. And I don't necessarily know, or I don't know much about the expertise of our viewers concerning the geography of the United States, but I'm sure everybody is aware of the fact that Wisconsin was never a part of the Confederacy, yet at these protests you did see somebody holding up the Confederate battle flag. Which, at least in the South, is sometimes depicted as a symbol of heritage rather than hate, a symbol of the region's history and pride rather than a symbol of racial injustice. But undoubtedly, that's not the case at these protests in Wisconsin and other places across the country. And instead, this flag stands for, or it has become a symbol of whites who feel persecuted, who feel that they are on the losing end of a competition with ethnic minorities for jobs, for places in schools. And it has become a symbol of whites who feel that they are now on the receiving end of a lot of discrimination rather than minorities. And it is these kinds of voters that you see at protests like these that, as we will see in a moment, played a pivotal role in Donald Trump's primary victory and also ultimately his presidential election victory. I want to quickly introduce some of the different issues that I will be talking about. First of all, the Republican Party has become the party of the white South. And I want to give a short historical account of how this came to be. And you can have entire lecture series, I think, about this development, but in this context, it's important to understand the transformation that the Republican Party has undergone, because it is really impossible to understand the Trump phenomenon without the interplay between race and this tremendous partisan realignment in arguably the most racially resentful region of the country. So the Republican Party conquered the South through racialized appeals, and this has resulted in an electorate within the Republican Party that sees demographic changes with a deep sense of dread and anxiety as well. Secondly, I want to address some of the demographic changes that we've seen in the country, which also contribute to the aforementioned sense of dread and anxiety. So we have long-term factors, the sort of the last 50 years of partisan realignment, and then we have short-term factors, the Obama presidency, President Obama winning the presidency despite losing the white vote by double digits twice, which really illustrated to white conservative voters in particular the decrease in the electoral crowd that they possess, and that election outcomes are these days also determined by minority voters. And ultimately, some scholars, for example, like Michael Tesler, who's written extensively on the topic of race, has wondered whether the Obama era, instead of ringing in sort of a post-racial era, instead of being this watershed moment pertaining to race and American politics, if it hasn't had the effect of bringing about a most racial era instead. And most certainly, I think the election of Donald Trump would be one indicator. And I want to present you with a number of different statistics, which will also illustrate how racial attitudes have become one of the central dividing lines in American politics today. And in doing so, I will illustrate that white Republicans increasingly feel that they are the target of discrimination, while white Democrats, on the other hand, in particular white Democrats, increasingly see discrimination against minorities. And perhaps subsequently in our discussion, we can discuss the matter if moving back or moving forward, further, or the increasing diversity of the country could actually sort of tear open more wounds rather than having the effect of bringing the nation together. Yeah, the first statistics that I want to show you is just a very basic one. What is the state of race relations? And we do see that things have taken a turn for the worse in recent years. Perhaps also interestingly enough, we do see that the poor state of race relations precedes the Trump presidency. I think in some cases you might argue that it sort of played a key role in contributing to Donald Trump's victory. And currently, you have almost an even split of people who say race relations are bad and race relations are good. With regards to the impact that Donald Trump has had on this, we also see that that Donald Trump's election and his time in office has led to a wide perception that it has become more common and perhaps also more acceptable in some ways to express racist or racially insensitive views. You see the overwhelming majority of Democrats feel this way, but even 42% of Republicans feel that somehow the election of Donald Trump has brought about a downturn, you could say, in public discourse and the racialization. And of course, there are numerous examples. If you look at Donald Trump and his comments, there are so many that we could spend the next few hours just going through all of them. One example that I want to mention is from a tweet from a couple of years ago. And this tweet has always stood out to me because he talks about illegal immigrants and, in other words, undocumented migrants pouring into the country and infesting the country. I think this choice of words, of course, highly questionable, but this is just one of the many examples of how Donald Trump's rhetoric on race has really sort of, you could say, perhaps poisoned the well. But as I will illustrate, this is not necessarily a particularly new development. Perhaps the manner, the open manner in which Donald Trump uses race is somewhat different from previous Republican administrations, but racially charged rhetoric has undoubtedly played a key role in Republican campaigns for a number of decades now. And if we want to circle back to the coronavirus, of course, Donald Trump's preference of using the term Chinese virus. And I recently came across a statistic which also showed that the term Chinese virus is quite popular among Fox News viewers as well, for somewhat obvious reasons. So Donald Trump as president and as a candidate, of course, has driven race to the fore, but his presidency and his successful campaign could not have come about without the long-term trends, trends that made racial sentiments a key factor in partisan preferences. And to explain this in a bit more detail, I want to take you on a quick journey through the history of partisan realignment over the past 50-odd years. Some of you may know something about the history of the American South, its political preferences. Just a quick introduction. Of course, the party that ultimately brought down slavery in a lot of ways and at least imposed a modicum of racial equality after the Civil War was the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. So the Republican brand after the end of the Reconstruction era, when essentially the South was once again able to govern itself, the Republican Party was damaged goods in that region for almost a century, from the 1870s until the 1960s. And the realignment since the 1960s is important because it helps us understand why race plays such a vital or prominent role. There are some scholars who, for example, argue that the Republican conquest of the South was based on other factors, perhaps chiefly economic factors. The South has seen a lot of economic growth over the past 50 years, but I personally do arrive at the conclusion that race played a central role, and maybe I'll be able to convince you of that conclusion as well. Ultimately, when you look at the history of the South, I think everybody kind of understands that with slavery and the effects afterwards, Jim Crow laws, segregation, it doesn't come as a surprise that V.O.K. Jr., who was one of the most prominent political scientists on Southern politics, argued in his landmark work on Southern politics in state and nation in the late 1940s that no matter which issue you looked at in the South, eventually you were always able to circle back to the position of the Black minority. So it didn't matter whether it was economics, cotton, other issues. At the end of the day, if you wanted to understand the partisan preferences of white Southerners, you would always have to look at the position of African Americans. Why is the South relevant in the context of this lecture? First of all, white Southerners and their attitudes on race continue to remain distinct from whites in the rest of the country, as I'll show or illustrate in a moment. And as the Republican Party has become the party of white Southerners, these sentiments on race-related matters have or are playing an ever increasingly important or relevant role within the Republican Party and its own attitudes on race. And race, of course, I mean, I want to once again mention this. There are numerous topics related to race. I also address immigration to a certain extent. So we're not talking about, racial policies in a very direct manner. But if you look at issues like the welfare state, issues like healthcare, these are topics, as I mentioned, that are quite racialized. And this is where the sentiments of white Southerners on race have really impacted and shifted the Republican Party's position on these topics. It's interesting, if you look at the history of the South, the traditional fears that you saw there regarding Black enfranchisement, racial equality, are now somewhat replicated at the national level. So if you go back in history and look at areas where the Democratic Party was the strongest in the South, back when the Democratic Party in the South was the party of white supremacy, these were places where you had a large Black minority, which wasn't allowed to vote. But the white population in those areas, which with large Black population concentrations, voted for candidates that promised to uphold segregation, promised to preserve white supremacy, because these whites felt that they stood to lose the most from Black enfranchisement. And in a certain way, you do see something similar transpiring at the national stage now, where white Republicans, conservative white Republicans, feel that the increasing diversity of the country is threatening their position. It's threatening their social status. It's threatening perhaps even their wealth, their affluence, their economic well-being. And it's just a fascinating, really, development of how these Southern attitudes that have very deep roots centuries-old roots are now present in a somewhat different manner at the national level as well. And the conclusion with regards to this would be, it's not that the Republican Party really conquered the South by enforcing its own views on the South, but it's more that Southerners just became Republican and brought their own values into the Republican Party. So if you look at the political realignment that took place in the South over the past 50-odd years, at its center really stands the white Southerner and their sentiments, and everything else has sort of revolved around it. Democrats have changed their own position on civil rights. Republicans have accommodated the position of white Southerners, but white Southerners in a lot of ways have stuck to their guns and have kept their ideological preferences on the topic of race, albeit in a slightly different and perhaps more moderate manner. So a couple of statistics which illustrate why Southern whites play such, or this is the sentiments of white Southerners play such a key role in driving certain racial divisions within the country. White Southerners are far more likely than non-Southern whites to say that they see themselves as white. So white identity plays a more central role in the South to this day. I mean, this is rather new data from a couple of years ago. White Southerners are also significantly more resentful than whites in the rest of the country. What you see here is the so-called racial resentment scale. And just a quick introduction into this. Racial resentment is essentially also referred to or known as symbolic racism or modern racism. It's distinct from traditional racism, which is based in biological views of racial superiority, and it's more based on cultural concerns. Essentially, it's the belief that there are certain quintessential American values, self-reliance, individualism, in opposition to an overbearing government, and the belief that certain ethnic or racial groups do not abide by those values. Certain groups are more in favor of a strong welfare state, and somehow that means that they are perennial outsiders and their views are essentially regarded as alien. And some scholars refer to this as or refer to racial resentment as a fusion between prejudice and small government conservatism. And as you can see in the Deep South, which is the 5 states in the sort of southeastern corner, except Florida, in the 1990s, the percentage of people who really were in the upper third of the racial resentment scale, the percentage of whites rather, was about 1.5 times as high as whites outside the country. So again, just to reiterate, these are the voters that the Republican Party sought to appeal to. One bit of information which I always also find quite fascinating and which I think is important to understand is just how non-existent the Republican Party was in the South, even in the 1960s. So if you look at 1961, the 87th Congress, Democrats won 99 of the region's 105 seats in the US House of Representatives. And this is sort of the starting point of the Republican conquest or attempt to conquer the South. And if you look at the most recent election in 2019, which of course I'm sure you remember was a pretty bad year for Republicans, Republicans were still able to win around 2/3 of all seats in the South. So this is a region that Republicans can count on no matter what, even if you have a bad national environment. And so in that sense, the South changed from the most Democratic region to the most Republican region over the span of about 50 years. How did this all come about? Again, a quick little historical introduction. A central person or a central figure in all of this was Barry Goldwater, the 1964 Republican candidate for the presidency. And in the early 1960s, Goldwater and various Republican strategists recognized that there was an opening in the South. This region, which had traditionally despised Republicans, was slowly but surely disconnecting itself from the Democratic Party, which became more and more progressive on the issue of civil rights and racial equality. And Goldwater and other Republican strategists figured out that the Republican Party was probably not going to win a significant share of the African-American vote or moderate voters in the rest of the country. So instead, as Goldwater somewhat infamously put it, the Republican Party ought to go hunting where the ducks are. And this has been the Republican strategy, you could say, from the 1960s onwards. meaning this is an opening. We have conservative voters that largely agree with us on an ideological basis, but that have traditionally voted Democratic. If we can win them over, we have an opportunity to fashion new conservative majorities. And how they won them over, this was being done largely through racialized appeals, as I'll get back to in a moment. If we just look at the election results, this is also fascinating because it once again illustrates or highlights the relevance of race in this transformation. Barry Goldwater did incredibly poorly in 1964. He only won 6 states, and one of those states was his home state of Arizona, and the other 5 states were the states of the Deep South. And I don't know if you can see it on the right, because this may be covered by the videos, but the last time the Deep South, these 5 states in question, had voted for a Republican was for the most part in the 1870s, in the era immediately after the Civil War, when the South was, to a certain extent, treated like a military colony by the Northern government, and the Army enforced somewhat free and fair elections, including the franchise for black men. But Goldwater won these states as the first Republican in close to a century. And he also did very well regarding the popular vote in these states. So the question is, Trump and his nativist racially charged language, is that something new? I'm sure in recent years you've sometimes come across articles or op-eds by Republicans, so-called never-Trumpers, who make the case that Trump and his rhetoric, or through his rhetoric, he is essentially besmirching the history, the heritage of the party of Lincoln. But what these authors are usually forgetting is that Trump is treading on a path, or is on a path that has been established by previous generations of Republican politicians and strategists. And the relevance of race was summed up quite well in this comment by Lee Atwater, who's to the left of President Reagan in this picture, and I apologize for his language. But Lee Atwater infamously made the case in the early 1980s that the sort of secret to Republican success was to appeal to racially conservative voters, but to do so in a language that allowed politicians to have plausible deniability. So they could talk about race without ever, they would be accused of talking about race, but they could deny actually talking about race. So Atwater made the case that even by the late 1960s, you could no longer openly present racially charged language, like using the N-word. And instead, you had to use a different language. You had to talk about other issues that were perhaps on the surface somewhat unrelated to race. And you had to then combine these issues with the topic of race. So for example, you could say, well, the integration of schools is nice and all, but should we really bus children across cities to these different schools into an environment that these children aren't really comfortable with? Something like that Republicans would refer to as forced busing doesn't make more sense for parents to decide themselves where they want to send their children. And bit by bit, all of this has become more abstract, as Atwater mentions, even by the 1980s. You'd reached a point where if you talk about taxes, if you talk about economics, if you talk about the welfare state, those issues can be presented in an outwardly non-racial manner, but they are intricately tied to race. And this, of course, perhaps also explains why some people might be forgiven for thinking that race hasn't really played a major role in US politics in recent decades, because, we've never had an outwardly or openly racist candidate, because these candidates or presidents all spoke about topics that were, at least on the surface or to the casual observer, unrelated to race. But the topic has always been there behind the surface. Perhaps one of the most notable examples of racialized language was Reagan's reference to the so-called welfare queen, where he did refer to a specific person, Linda Taylor, who was convicted of welfare fraud in the late 1970s, and her story made the rounds during that era. Now, Reagan never mentioned Linda Taylor by name or her ethnic background, which was somewhat confusing. But he mentioned, he referred to Chicago, he referred to an urban area. He essentially made the case that you've got people who are committing welfare fraud, people that are living off of your tax dollars, you know, while you're trying to make ends meet, this person's getting $150,000 off of welfare. And this kind of rhetoric, we know from a variety of studies, did stoke racial animosity. But it's also sort of something of an ingenious approach, because you are able to appeal to both sort of small government conservatives by saying this is why welfare is bad, but you're also able to appeal to racial conservatives who perhaps actually stand to gain from certain welfare measures by presenting welfare as something that supposedly primarily benefits the minority community. Now, this isn't something that you just see decades ago. A couple of years ago, Paul Ryan, who was the Republican Party's 2012 vice presidential candidate, made a comment which was somewhat criticized in the American media, but not to a large extent. But he talked about inner cities, and there are a few coded terms, as Lee Atwater would perhaps call them, but there are a few coded terms that are more racialized than inner city. You know, if you talk about inner cities in an American context, it conjures up a certain image of a largely Black community. So Paul Ryan talked about a tailspin of culture, essentially people in the inner cities being lazy and not having the right kind of work ethic. I don't know if Paul Ryan necessarily wanted to stoke racial animus or animosity by doing so, but it just illustrates the extent to which this kind of narrative, this kind of approach, if you will, has become deeply embedded within the Republican Party and within the Republican mindset. And his running mate, of course, in 2012 made some somewhat similar comments. His infamous, Mitt Romney's infamous 47% comments. And again, on the surface, you might say, does this have anything to do with race? But if you break it down a bit further, you see that Mitt Romney talked about President Obama's voters. And who are or were President Obama's voters? They were disproportionately non-white. And he talked about people that were dependent on government handouts and who believed that they are entitled to things, entitled to your tax dollars and so forth. And so, yeah, he made that kind of comment, even though I think we all remember his campaign at least didn't strike the sort of casual observer as being particularly racialized. And interestingly enough, the day after the election, he made a comment which I personally found quite interesting, where Mitt Romney made the case that President Obama won by handing out gifts, by giving money to his core electorate, disproportionately non-white voters. And Mitt Romney specifically pointed out Hispanic voters, giving them free stuff. So this is rhetoric that essentially stands in the tradition of what Lee Atwater talked about in the early 1980s. The point is, in all of this, that race and racialized appeals have become a central part of American politics at the highest levels for the past 50-odd years, even if, at least on the surface, it may not appear to be the case. And moreover, the Republican Party's composition has changed because of that. Just a couple of paragraphs that I wanted to show you to illustrate the changes of the Republican Party, if we keep in mind that the South is more racially resentful, more racially conservative. If you look at these charts, you kind of understand the impact that this must have had and has had on the composition of the Republican Party at the elite level. So in 1961, just 4% of all Republican members of the House of Representatives were from the South. After the most recent election, that share had ballooned or shot up to 45%. All in all, the South is home to 32% of all congressional districts, so a notable overrepresentation of Southerners within the GOP caucus, and therefore also a representation of or an overrepresentation of the Southern mindset within the GOP caucus. And since we are on the cusp of another presidential election, if you look at the different performance of Republican candidates inside and outside of the South, you see that at least in the immediate post-war era, after World War II, Republican candidates tended to do better outside of the South, as I mentioned, or as I just illustrated for obvious reasons. Eisenhower winning close to 100% of all the electoral votes outside of the South. And then between the late 1960s and late 1980s, essentially Republican popularity moved in tandem. So Republican candidates were popular both outside and inside of the South. 1976 being the notable exception, with the former governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, running on the Democratic ticket. But what's most notable about this is that in recent years, we have seen a gap opening up between the racially more conservative South and the rest of the nation. And Republican candidates have fared far better in the South than outside. So for example, Donald Trump won 91% of all Southern electoral votes compared to roughly 40% in the rest of the country. So as I mentioned, these are the sort of long-term trends. What about some of the trends in recent years that have had an impact on the relevance of race and just sort of attitudes of Republican voters in particular regarding race? America has undergone a substantial demographic transformation in recent years and decades, and it is set to only continue and perhaps even pick up speed in future years. This has, as I will show in a moment, had a profound impact on partisan majorities, on the manner in which candidates win elections, with conservative whites increasingly recognizing that their preferences play an ever smaller role as their share of the population decreases. Now, some of you may know this conservative columnist and author, Ann Coulter. I chose this because sometimes you can judge a book by its cover, which is the case in this instance. A book of hers on the transformation of America, or her perceived transformation of America, and this notion that as the country becomes more Hispanic, as Hispanics represent an ever larger share of the electorate and the population, it will, according to Ann Coulter and a lot of her disciples, a lot of her supporters, the country will become invariably less American. So there's this argument that, well, we have certain American values, and immigration or the demographic changes that the country is undergoing will make the country less American. So we're talking about, in a lot of ways, primarily a cultural concern rather than an economic fear. And of course, I mean, this is not necessarily directly related to race, as I'll get back to in a moment. I don't want to sort of conflate these different issues too much, but race and immigration, these are two sort of, you could say, two sides of the same coin in this instance. So it's worth remembering that Republican attitudes on race and immigration are somewhat similar, and that the gap between the two parties on these two issues is somewhat similar as well. Now, the average Democratic voter, rather the average Republican voter is somewhat fearful about their decreasing electoral clout. And we do see that non-Hispanic whites, in other words, white voters without an Hispanic background, which is what we usually mean when we refer to whites, or when studies and surveys refer to whites, their share of the electorate has gone down quite substantially in recent years. In 2020, we can expect the non-Hispanic white share of the electorate to drop below 70% for the first time in the country's history, as Hispanics will probably become the largest minority share of the population over the upcoming decade. Now, why do these changes perhaps engender political fears among some whites? As I mentioned, you have these traditional Southern fears of sort of becoming a stranger in your own political home. And these kinds of fears are present among Republican voters as well in a lot of ways. Why is that? Well, we do see that the demographic transformation of the country has actually had a profound impact on partisan majorities. If you look at the 1988 election, or if you look at these three elections and look at the Republican shares of the vote among the three important ethnic groups or racial groups, Republicans on all three occasions won about 60% of the white vote, about 10% of the African American vote, and about 30% of the Hispanic vote. But in 1988, that was enough to win a landslide victory of about 8 percentage points rather. But within a quarter of a century, within 24 years, that comfortable Republican victory had turned into a relatively comfortable Democratic victory, and these trends are only set to continue. So even though I would say, I don't approve of perhaps Republican fears and their anxieties, we do see that the changing demographic composition of the country has had something of an impact on how partisan majorities are fashioned and established. As I mentioned at the very beginning, Barack Obama winning the presidency despite losing the white vote by double digits, an historic first, which also drove home a similar point. Now, if you look at the ethnic composition of the parties, we also see a substantial racial divide that has opened up. The Republican Party has remained the party of whites, while the Democratic Party has really become the party of ethnic and racial minorities. So over the course of a quarter of a century between 1992 and 2016, the share of whites decreased by 16% among the general population of registered voters, a quarter among Democrats, but just 8% among Republicans. Ultimately, this means that the wide gap between Democrats and Republicans stood at 17 percentage points in 1992 before expanding to 30 points in 2016. And I'm pretty sure that by 2020, that gap has only widened even further. It's perhaps also interesting to note that relatively recently, scholars still felt whiteness and white identity wasn't really a politically potent issue or politically potent factor. So in 2006, a decade before Donald Trump won the presidency, these two scholars, David Sears and Victoria Savalle, concluded that because whites were still dominant numerically, socially, economically, and politically, whiteness wasn't really relevant to them. It wasn't really a noteworthy factor. And their conclusion was that white group consciousness would not be a major political force in white political attitudes today. Again, I think a decade later, we can conclude that things have somewhat changed, but whiteness has become more relevant. I think it played a substantial or a key role in getting Donald Trump elected, because the sort of the sense of dominance that being white is not just the norm, but that whites are in charge of determining the outcome of elections, that has changed quite substantially. Now, I want to talk a bit about the attitudes on race. So I've addressed the sort of long-term historic trends which led us to where we are today. I've looked at the perhaps transformation of the past decade or so, the Obama presidency, and not necessarily President Obama's actions, but just the fact that you saw the election of the first Black man thanks to a very diverse electoral coalition. Those trends have led us to a state of race or to a country today where race presents one of the key dividing lines in society. So while Donald Trump is the result of long-term trends, there is evidence of an ever-growing gap on racial attitudes and attitudes towards American diversity that is a somewhat recent phenomenon. And as I mentioned, this divide has become a central factor in US politics. And it's important to remember that this is not just due to the transformation of the Republican Party, but that the Democratic Party and its supporters have moved quite markedly on this issue as well over the past few years. So I want to present you with a number of different, with some empirical evidence which illustrates this gap on race and attitudes related to race. At the most basic level, we have the question, what do you think about the demographic transformation of the country? In about 30 years, America will probably be a majority-minority nation, meaning that non-Hispanic whites will only constitute a minority of the nation, whereas all other groups, which are grouped together as being the minority today, will form a majority. Unsurprisingly, you do see that Democrats see this as something that's rather good, or that's good rather than bad. A majority of Democrats think that this isn't going to have a particularly big impact, but let's just leave those voters aside for a second. But on the other side, you do see that Republicans see this with far more dread, far more anxiety. What is perhaps surprising about all of this is that white Democrats and white liberals in particular have moved to the left or in a more progressive direction on this topic, far more so than non-white Democrats. So for example, when a similar question is asked in the American National Election Study, whether diversity is good and whether it makes the country a better place to live, we do see that white Democrats are substantially more likely than non-white Democrats, and of course far more likely than white Republicans, to see this as a positive development. If we look at other attitudes pertaining to race and the question of white privilege, we also see that white Democrats have moved in a progressive or a more left-leaning direction in recent years. So 40% of white Democrats feel that white people benefit a great deal from the advantages or from certain advantages in society that African Americans simply do not have. And this is obviously, I mean, if you look at the graph, white Republicans haven't changed that much. The change isn't really statistically significant from 2017 to 2019, but obviously the average white Democrat and the average white Republican have a completely different interpretation of whiteness and the privilege that whiteness bestows upon members of or white members of society. This also, unsurprisingly, means that a large share of white Democrats believe that more needs to be done when it comes to racial equality. Among white Republicans, on the other hand, a majority believes that, first of all, there is no need for further action. But when you do break it down into should we do more or have we actually gone too far, it's perhaps interesting to see that close to a third of all white Republicans actually believe that we've gone, or that the United States, the government has gone too far in trying to implement and introduce racial equality. And this is, once again, a similar chart that paints a somewhat similar picture. The basic question, do you think the discrimination still exists, or do you think that perhaps too much is being made of discrimination that doesn't actually exist? And close, or more than 3/4 of all Republicans, white Republicans rather, believe that the central sort of challenge in American society today is that too much is being made of imaginary discrimination, if you will. And whereas among white Democrats, the exact opposite is the case, that they believe discrimination, or they rather believe that most people are still oblivious to the discrimination around them, that the discrimination that is present in the country to this day concerning minorities. Yeah, as I mentioned, it's worth remembering that white Democrats and liberals have changed their attitudes on these matters in a significant manner in recent years. The reasons for that aren't necessarily quite clear. On the one hand, of course, you can say that maybe racism has become more prevalent in American society today. Some scholars argue that maybe it's down to news consumption, that certain left-leaning newspapers are talking more than ever about race. This can, of course, also be the case because there is more racism, but the argument is sometimes made that maybe white Democrats see more racism because they're given the impression through their media diet. Regardless, fact of the matter is that white Democrats have become far more liberal on the issue of race, with them, as I mentioned, adopting sometimes a more progressive position than even minorities on the issue of race. This is one of the questions, if you look at the chart, this is one of the questions that is traditionally used to gauge racial resentment, which I mentioned earlier on, this sort of cultural form of modern racism, where people are asked, well, other minorities have worked their way up without any sort of government aid, blacks should do the same. And if you disagree with that statement, then obviously you are, you do believe that more government help to mitigate racial equality needs to be introduced. And again, you do see that white liberals on this issue have moved quite substantially to the left, even overtaking African Americans. And of course, this African American subgroup also includes conservative or Republican African Americans, which is a rather small share, though. And this chart just shows a similar picture there, that white liberal Democrats are actually significantly more likely than blacks to believe that when it comes to the continued problems that parts of the black community face, that this is down to racial discrimination rather than sort of personal responsibilities and personal wrongdoings. I wanted to include this chart because it's, first of all, very recent data, and I found it quite interesting. The Pew Research Center asked Democratic voters, well, the likely Democratic nominee is a white man in his 70s. Does that bother you? And that's quite interesting. You do see that Hispanics and blacks within the Democratic Party have far less of a problem with that factor than white Democrats do. So to just move on to once again, the sort of differences between the two parties. As I mentioned, the theme of this lecture, of course, is supposed to be that issues or attitudes pertaining to race have become one of the central dividing lines in society. In other words, if I ascertain your attitudes on racial equality or inequality, I'm able to discern your partisan identity from that. And you do see that, for example, on this central question, why can't black people get ahead? In 1994, you had a gap of just 13 points between the two parties. Now that gap has widened to 50 points. On immigration, I mentioned immigration is a topic that ought to be included as well, because it is heavily intertwined with the issues of race and ethnicity and the status anxiety that white Republicans feel with regards to the demographic changes the country is undergoing. You also see the substantial gap. In the 1990s, if you told me your attitude on immigration, I wouldn't really have been able to figure out whether you were a Democrat or a Republican. That's completely different today. And once again, also on this issue, white Democrats really stand out for their progressivism on the topic, whereas black Democrats are notably less enthusiastic about increasing immigration, which of course also has something to do with the economic position of black Democrats. Now, I usually don't like including slides with that much text, but the next slide is something that I did want to include because I think it illustrates quite well how things have changed over the course of a quarter of a century. This is an excerpt from the 1996 Democratic Party platform on the topic of immigration. And if I had removed all of the references to the Democrats and the year and the president, I think you probably would have guessed that this is a draft version of this year's Republican platform. So, if it had said, today's Republican Party believes we must remain a nation of laws, we cannot tolerate illegal immigration, and we must stop it. For years before Donald Trump became president, Washington talked tough but failed to act. In 2016, our borders might as well not have existed. They were under-patrolled, and what patrols they were under-equipped, drugs flowed freely, and so forth. Again, this kind of illustrates the changes that the Democratic Party has undergone on the topic, and that this gap on certain attitudes related to race and immigration is not just down to Republican attitudes. Now, the final subchapter deals with, this is where I want to pay some attention or shift the focus to the Republican Party. As I mentioned, we are seeing something of a replication of Southern white fears at the national level, driven obviously by the internal changes that the Republican Party has undergone. Looking at to 2020 and beyond, one important factor to remember is that Donald Trump in 2016 encountered a very favorable opportunity structure. So sometimes, perhaps if you remember, the argument was, well, Trump has taken over the party. It's a hostile takeover. He's changed the party. He's moving the party in a completely different direction on race or immigration with his nativist message. But that wasn't really the case. Donald Trump won the 2016 primaries because he appealed to an existing electorate. One story that I remember is that, for example, his son Eric and daughter Ivanka weren't able to vote for him in the New York primaries, which, as was mentioned at the beginning, were I think canceled or delayed this time around. But they weren't able to vote in the New York primaries 4 years ago because they failed to register as Republicans in time. So Donald Trump didn't bring in any or a substantial number of new voters, but he appealed to the existing Republican electorate. And their attitudes, as we will see in a second, means that like-minded future Republican candidates can probably be quite hopeful in getting or in winning the nomination of the Republican Party on a somewhat similar path. In other words, Trump's lane to the nomination will seem enticing to future Republican candidates as well. Basically, the fundamental question, who do you think is under attack right now? Is it white people or racial minorities? Republicans are far more likely to say that they believe white peoples are currently under attack. This poll was conducted in the summer of 2018. The previous poll was conducted a year earlier after what transpired in Charlottesville. So this is the reason behind this sort of race-related poll. And it's interesting that over the course of a year, the Republican share of people who believe that white people are currently under attack actually went up by 8 percentage points. So you do see an increasing sentiment among Republicans that whites are now on the receiving end of discrimination, that the tables have been turned. Yeah, so this is also something that we've seen in American history. Perhaps, I don't know, after this lecture or over the coming days, I would suggest that you perhaps check out some videos on YouTube of George Wallace's 1968 campaign, and you will encounter sentiments and narratives both expressed by George Wallace and his supporters, which are really similar to what we're seeing among Republican voters today, the sense that things have changed for the worse, the country is heading down the drain, American culture is in a worse state than ever before, namely because of the impact of the political clout that minorities have and so forth. So you're seeing that, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same in that sense. Fundamentally, also Republicans, again, this data illustrates something similar. If I look at the time, I think I have to hurry up just a bit. But yeah, an overwhelming majority of Republicans, first of all, believes that discrimination against whites is as big a problem as discrimination against minorities. An overwhelming share of Republicans also believes that immigrants are a threat to the country's cultural and ethnic background. Just think back to the cover of Adios America. And this is a gap to bring together the two parties once again that has emerged in recent years. So in 2006, thinking back to the text by Sears and Savalet, when they argued whiteness didn't really play a potent political role. In 2006, both Democrats and Republicans believed that there wasn't a lot of discrimination against whites. And since then, a notable gap has emerged between the two parties, and Republicans are now, or Republican whites are now 3 times as likely as Democrats to believe that there is a lot of discrimination against whites. The final bit of information that I want to leave you with is I started off by talking about the history of the Republican Party over the last 50 years. And the case that I wanted to make is that Trump was really able to use an environment that was very favorable to him. It wasn't really, in my view, I mean, Trump's success wasn't really owed as much to his own campaign as it was to the electorate that he encountered. So by 2012, 2016, the share of Republicans with high racial resentment scores was quite high. So there was a far bigger potential electorate for somebody like Donald Trump. There have been campaigns in the past, for example, by Pat Buchanan in the early 1990s, which ran on a somewhat similar nativist platform. But in the early 1990s, you didn't have the kind of racially conservative electorate that is present in the Republican Party today. And if we want to talk about the question of did Donald Trump owe his success to race or other issues, I think this particular chart speaks a pretty clear language. You see that those with the highest racial resentment levels were far more likely, or this looks at Republican primary voters. Republican primary voters with the highest racial resentment levels were far more likely than those with the lowest ones to support Donald Trump. You didn't have this kind of divide within the party in the 2 previous election cycles. Mm-hmm. So racial resentment, both in 2008 and 2012, did not serve as a predictor for whether Republicans supported in the primaries the eventual Republican nominee. But that was different in 2016. Trump won because of his appeals to the most racially resentful Republican primary voters, and he won because these kinds of voters are making up a far bigger share within the GOP than in the past. This genuinely is the final graph that I want to show you because, again, the theme in all of this has been race is one of the central dividing lines in US society today, and you do see that Republican voters are far more racially resentful than Democratic voters, as the numbers show there. 91% of those who said that they supported Trump in this summer of 2016 poll had a racial resentment score above the national average, and a lot of them had a score in the highest quartile. So just to conclude, a couple of things that I want to leave you with also with regards to our outlook at 2020 and beyond. Donald Trump is not a short-term phenomenon. Trumpism essentially is, I would say, a version of post-1964 republicanism on steroids. You know, it's a somewhat stronger, more potent variety of this kind of ideology, but it does stand in the tradition of that kind of ideology, of that kind of approach, appealing to racially conservative, racially resentful nativist voters. This means as we move beyond Donald Trump, just because Donald Trump is gone, that doesn't necessarily mean, or won't mean, in my view, that we've passed into a better and brighter future with regards to racial equality and race and its use in American politics. These status anxieties that I just illustrated, they are present within Republican voters, among Republican voters. And if anything, we see an increasing trend of white Republicans feeling anxious, feeling that their social status is threatened by the increasing diversity of the country. Race as an issue was never really gone. As I showed, it's been used by Republicans for the last half century. And it's been sort of combined with recent grievances among white conservative voters regarding the demographic changes of the country. Therefore, racial sentiments are one of the central cleavages in US politics today. You know, traditionally, if you look at statistics, you might say, tell me your income, tell me your education, and I know that who you're going to vote for. This has been joined by the sentiments on race. If I know your positions on who's being discriminated against, is there such a thing as white privilege, I'm able to pretty accurately predict who you're going to vote for. And the impact on US politics, if I want to circle back to the very beginning, the issues that we're facing in the US, gridlock, not being able to come to any kind of compromises on issues like immigration reform, reforming the welfare state and so forth, healthcare, that is directly tied to the gap between the supporters of both parties. And this has had disastrous results, as I mentioned, with regards to the coronavirus that the country is dealing with right now. The death within the Black and minority community, that is in a lot of ways tied to the continued poor healthcare coverage. If you look at the economic impact of COVID-19, people filing for unemployment, this is also where Black and members of the minority community are disproportionately affected. And this is also one of those issues where a lot of help isn't being made available traditionally because welfare is such a racialized topic. Finally, a bit of product placement for my part. As was mentioned at the very beginning, I did write a book on the Republican Party last year. So if you want to find out a bit more on the themes that I've just elaborated upon, or if we want to read more on this topic, maybe you might want to take a look at this book. And finally, I'm looking forward to any and all of your questions related to this topic. This just the final maps, which showed, according to the predictions of this website, of 538, who would win the different districts, whether if only non-white people voted or if only working class white people voted. And you see, this is one of the key rifts, one of the key gaps in American society. So again, I'm now looking forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Adolf, for this really illuminating talk, which shows how pervasive race stays, even where it's not explicit, but also stays as a divisive topic once we talk about it. So we do have time for questions, and our audience can use the menu of Zoom. There are these blue hands that you can raise, and our moderator will pick you out if you have a question. And we also collected a couple of questions from students in my seminar. I teach a seminar on the occasion of the presidential election 2020, Media, Culture, Power. And so we have 3 questions of those students, but we would like to begin with the audience. And so please raise your blue hands and you will be called upon. And I assume there will be questions, comments, criticism, maybe, we'll see.
Yeah, the first hand I can see comes from a participant named Omega3. I'm going to unmute you and you can ask your question if you wish.
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
yes we can.
Yeah, it's Matt Sheedy. I couldn't switch my name. Omega3 is my alter ego. Let's go with that. Thank you very much, Philip, for this really fascinating conversation. I want to ask you a fairly broad, open-ended question. Certainly, I imagine most of us would agree that race plays a very significant determinative role in U.S. politics and elections and so forth. But more recently, after the 2008 economic crisis, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the rise of Bernie Sanders, the question of class very much got back onto the table. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, generally speaking, of some of the intersections between questions of race and class, or perhaps lack thereof. Certainly, as you point out, questions of identity and identity politics amongst white voters seem to be more and more prominent in let's say, the recent decade or so. And yet the question of class seems to be one that's there on the margins, but very fuzzy in my estimation. Just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question, Matt. I think definitely in the context of Republican voters, class plays less of a role. I mean, we do see that across the South, for example, voters with white voters living in poverty nonetheless support Republican candidates. In the context, I think, of the recent Democratic primaries, it's quite interesting how Bernie Sanders failed to be able to win over a lot of black voters with his message of social equality and sort of a social revolution, if you will. That's perhaps sort of demonstrates the centrality of identity in a lot of ways. Joe Biden came out and ran a campaign which really focused on him being the vice president, former vice president of, or the vice president of the former president Barack Obama, and trying to make the point that he was going to fight for more racial equality, whereas Bernie Sanders, of course, tried to combine this and try to make the case that his battle for social equality, for a more just society, a more just economy, was going to ultimately, of course, benefit or help African Americans as well because of their economic status in society. But he wasn't really able to make significant inroads into the older black community, more so among younger black voters. And there are, of course, numerous factors related to that. Why did older black voters focus more so on electability, for example? Older black voters have a far better sort of perception of the Democratic Party. That played a role as well. So Bernie Sanders' message of saying, we should sort of bring down the Democratic establishment, that didn't really play all that well with African American voters who see the party as an agent for racial equality. So I think on both sides you do see identity still playing a key role, both among African American voters on the Democratic side and even less affluent white voters on the Republican side. And it'll be interesting to see how perhaps future Democratic hopefuls will try to use this message, if they are going to learn a lesson from that and say, how can we combine social equality with racial equality more so than Bernie Sanders did, who he really tried to avoid race, not necessarily at all costs, but really went down a significantly different road.
All right, if this answered your question, another hand was raised by Luis Manuel Ontiveros. I'm going to unmute you and now you can ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Adolf. This is a very interesting lecture. My question is more related to the topic of like, I think it's a little bit related to Matt's question, to Dr. Sheedy's question, and also some of the things that you mentioned. But I would like to see if you could like elaborate a little bit more further on the side of the Republican Party that is more focused on like libertarianism, or like libertarian, kind of like very conservative economics in a way, and I like not only that, but the entire like media conglomerate behind that, a little bit like the Koch brothers and like people like this who are like really developing like these media outlets, and a little bit like what you would say about like the intersection between, I mean, you have like Fox News and stuff, but like a little bit like if you could talk a little bit more about this intersection, which I think is very fascinating. It's one I think is probably very related.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. I mean, as I think I may have mentioned during the talk, one of the sort of ingenious aspects of Republican political strategies over the past 50-odd years has been that their message is able to please both sides. You know, if you present an anti-welfare message, a small government message that on the one hand appeals to economic conservatives who want to slash budgets and so forth, but it also appeals to people with a certain racially resentful position because they see the welfare state as this sort of a mechanism for redistributing wealth from hardworking Americans to the undeserving poor. In this sense, undeserving means that they are not deserving of any sort of help. It's interesting, perhaps. I mean, you mentioned the Koch brothers. Of course, these COVID-19 protests in a lot of places are also similar to the Tea Party, somewhat astroturfed. You know, these are not natural protest movements that have just sprang up out of nowhere, but you do see, very wealthy donors behind the scenes sort of pushing these people out onto the streets and saying, getting them to say, we want to go back to work, and this is wrong, this will wreck the economy, and this is just, this is socialism, this is an overbearing government. Even though you could say a lot of the people probably at these protests would perhaps stand to gain from a different approach as well. If something like, I don't know, universal basic income were introduced, or at least for the duration of the crisis, they would benefit from that too. So I think that strategists, whether they're libertarian or just economically conservative, have recognized the potential that you have there by in terms of, you could say the electoral potency, the electoral strength that a message has that is economically conservative, but that can also be combined and linked to these broader narratives of what does it mean to be a real American. As I mentioned, somewhat perhaps oversimplified, but this notion that being an American means self-sufficiency, individualism, a certain work ethic, and that if you are dependent on government handouts, or supposedly dependent on government handouts, that makes you less of an American. So there is undoubtedly a very big sort of complex behind the Republican Party, or within the sort of conservative movement of whether it's wealthy donors or strategists who are able to really, they know which buttons to push. And that's something that you mentioned. Fox News sort of creates or supports a similar narrative. This notion of well, what does it mean to be American? America is changing to a certain extent, or it's changing beyond recognition because of demographic changes. You have somebody like Tucker Carlson that you may be aware of, who constantly talks about immigration, and so this is a situation where the people perhaps behind the scenes who stand to gain from Republican economic policies use a somewhat different approach to win elections and to galvanize their own electorate. And of course, some of you may know this, What's the Matter with Kansas, a book that was written on the topic, which delved into this and essentially made the case that less affluent white voters are duped into voting for economic policies against their own best interest by, talking about these cultural hot button issues, whether it's abortion or immigration.
Cool. Thank you very much for your answer. It was very interesting. Definitely.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Are there more hands up at the moment?
At present, I don't. Oh yes, there is just one coming in by Elizabeth Schäfer-Winter. I'm gonna unmute you. You can speak.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. My question ties in with what you actually just said. There were white voters, white blue-collar voters, who voted for Obama in 2008 and who switched to Trump in 2016. Was it only immigration that got them there? Because simply they did vote for a Black candidate once at least. And what was the motivation? Was it economic anxieties, immigration, probably a combination of many things, but race alone, I think may not fully explain this shift.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question as well. Yeah, as you point out, I think there, as is the case with all of these populist politicians, whether it's the success of the AfD in Germany or Marine Le Pen in France, for example, there are numerous different factors that play a role here. And I certainly don't want to give the impression that it's always all about race, perhaps primarily about race. There were other factors as well here. I think Trump's populist message, sort of the anti-elitist message, appealed to certain voters. This notion that Washington is broken and so forth. And of course, interestingly enough, that's something that also has very long-term ties within or deep roots within the Republican Party. The message that Washington is broken and that you have pointy-headed intellectuals in Washington D.C. that are drawing up different schemes, and they don't really know what the common man wants. So I think Trump's populist message appealed to certain voters. With regards to economic anxieties, the problem sometimes there is that it's difficult to, of course, figure out who exactly voted for Obama a couple of years ago and then switched to Trump. We have these so-called pivot counties, in other words, counties that voted for Obama once or twice and then went for Trump. We see that these counties are by and large more white than the average county. They are less educated than the average county, and they're also less affluent than the average county. So I think that certain economic concerns played a role here. The feeling that the economic recovery, perhaps from 2008 onwards, didn't really have the desired effect, that people were still feeling less well off than they were before the crisis hit. So you do have these voters as well who were then also sort of roped in by this populist message, which in a lot of ways also is related to different cultural factors. So yeah, undoubtedly, I think that there also was a somewhat smaller subset of Obama to Trump voters that really had certain economic concerns, even though it's worth remembering or worth pointing out that different studies on the topic sometimes provide different results. One study that I remember, for example, illustrated that the poorest white voters were more likely to support Hillary Clinton rather than Donald Trump. So even there, sometimes the popular narrative that you had this almost peasant revolt which voted for Trump isn't really true there as well. In terms of, if I had to conclude before I go on too long here, I think we're talking about some voters that had certain economic anxieties that were perhaps somewhat less tangible. You're not talking about the unemployed. You're not talking about voters that really have immediate economic concerns. Again, this is similar to AfD voters, but voters that see dark clouds on the horizon, voters that, for example, feel, well, China is taking over our economy, our businesses, our manufacturing is moving abroad. Maybe these people aren't directly affected by this, but they do feel that the economy is perhaps heading in a direction that's not particularly good, and they perhaps felt that Donald Trump was going to put an end to this, that they might not have agreed with everything that he said on perhaps even race, but they did feel that this message of economic nationalism was something that they could certainly agree with, and that this was something that the country should pursue in terms of economics, in terms of the trade wars and so forth.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe you could address one or two questions that the students sent along. I don't know whether the students are here with us, but we have questions.
Yeah, exactly. One of the questions that was asked was, how does the election of the so-called first white president, Donald Trump, and his xenophobic tendencies affect African-American identity? I think in terms of, I mean, there was one poll that I looked at, which, for example, showed that 52% of African Americans say that being Black is extremely important to how they think about themselves, compared to just 5% among white Americans, for example. So you do see that this was a poll from 2019, which I think sadly hadn't been conducted in the years before, so it's difficult to see a trend there. But I do think that ultimately what the election of Donald Trump revealed to African-American voters was that perhaps Barack Obama's presidency wasn't the watershed moment that they had hoped for, that this was almost a bit of an outlier, that this was not the new normal, that African-American candidates could win elections, and that we'd turned a corner, turned a page, if you will, in the history of the United States. That the dark days of previous decades where Black candidates constantly ran into these problems of ultimately not being able to overcome white candidates, that this had come to an end. And I think that, again, it illustrated to Black voters that more needed to be done. I think the selection of Joe Biden as the Democratic candidate and his emphasis on fighting for more racial equality and getting Trump out of office because of his nativism, because of his xenophobia, that's also somewhat indicative of African Americans seeing political issues through a bit of an identitarian lens, if you will, or through the lens of identity. Yeah, again, I think in general, just for the Black community, they do recognize, or they do see that that all is not well, if you will, that race relations aren't that good. If I think the first poll that I showed in this lecture, in this presentation, was on the state of race relations, you do see that African Americans are far more likely to see race relations as bad than white Americans today. So if you look at the charts right there, you see a strong increase in the share of African Americans who see a problem here. The second question that I had a look at was the question concerning police brutality. Of course, an issue that has played a defining role in recent years. I think perhaps if some of the viewers are fans of the National Football League, they may remember Colin Kaepernick and his kneeling protests during the national anthem, which was related to police brutality and racism in general. And the question was, what can the president do with regards to reducing police brutality, and did Barack Obama have more success in the fight against police brutality? First of all, at the most basic level, I think you can say the president, all he can do is use his bully pulpit to make the case that police forces should pay more attention to racism within perhaps within their own ranks. The president himself can implement very little, but what Obama did he did bring attention to the issue, of course. I mean, if you think back to Michael Brown and Ferguson, he spoke about this. The Department of Justice looked at a potential civil rights violation there as well. So he was somewhat proactive on this issue. And I think this was quite difficult for Obama to do as well, because obviously he realized and recognized as the first Black president that sometimes there was this issue, do I really want to be seen as an advocate for Black issues, or could this possibly be interpreted as trying to drive a racial wedge through society? but he eventually, on a number of occasions, of course, came out and spoke also the issue of Trayvon Martin, even though this, or the murder and death of Trayvon Martin, even though this wasn't necessarily related to police brutality. So Obama used his position to speak out against this, and we have seen some changes there. You know, police forces forcing their officers to wear video cameras and so forth, and that is perhaps somewhat related to the president shining a light on this issue. Donald Trump has, of course, or not of course, but unsurprisingly, perhaps taken the exact opposite position, you know, talking about Blue Lives Matter, making this case that police officers are under attack, and also, of course, attacking Colin Kaepernick for his kneeling protest, in general, attacking the NFL for giving players the ability to speak out against or to use the opportunity during the national anthem to you know, make a political case. So Trump has taken the exact opposite position on those issues, again, which isn't that surprising because he sees himself as something of an anti-Obama. So if President Obama took the position of we need to take action against racism in police forces, President Trump, unsurprisingly, essentially said, well, actually, the real problem isn't police brutality, but it's cops being attacked by society in general, and these the police officers are providing safety and security for all of us, and instead of attacking them, we ought to support them. So, I mean, this entire issue of police brutality has also become one of the sort of central divides in American society. If you ask Republicans about the topic and Democrats, you will get two completely different answers on the issue, as you will on a variety of other topics as well, of course.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one question. So I step back with my questions. I can ask you those issues at a different occasion. So I think we take one more question, and then we're gonna take a short look to the next week, and then this will be it for tonight. So yeah, if we have one more question, that would be great.
I think we do, by Lilian Elisa Hachenberg. I'll unmute you and please speak.
Well, thank you for your very insightful talk. I was wondering about third-party candidates and how and if race is a factor in their program. I mean, if we take those candidates as expressions of attempts to maybe give those a voice who are dissatisfied with the current two-party system, how is the question of race addressed there? Do they tap into similar rhetorical traditions? Do they lean more to Democratic or Republican standpoints? And maybe how did their voter numbers develop in the past? And could they be related to the very opposing positions of the two main parties? And yes, I have to say, I am aware that the majority of voters view voting non-democratic or non-Republican, their votes as lost votes. But I'm still wondering how third-party reception and voting impact has developed in the past and maybe is developing right now.
Thank you for your question. I mean, this, I would say, of course, touches upon almost a significantly broader topic, well beyond the race, the question of third-party candidates. What's fascinating is 4 years ago, we had two candidates that were the most unpopular candidates by a long ways ever in the history of the country, yet both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump won a combined, I think, 95% of the vote. And even the somewhat, at least initially promising third-party candidacy by Gary Johnson, the Libertarian candidate, eventually fizzled out. I think in general, third-party candidates, you don't hear a lot about them on race. I think that's more of a general approach to say we need to move beyond the polarized society that we have today. And of course, I mean, part of what I wanted to convey in this lecture was that the polarization that we do see in American society is somewhat related to race. You know, the realignment of the South created these two ideologically cohesive and distinct parties, with Republicans always being conservative on one issue and Democrats always being liberal or moderate on another issue. So in a lot of ways, the polarization that we see in society is related to the realignment of the South based on race. So third-party candidates try to usually counteract these moves and say, we need to bring the country together. We need to overcome our divides, and there's more that unites us than divides us. Ultimately, I think that chances are pretty slim. I mean, sometimes you'll come across these polls which show that there are more independents than ever. But when you actually sort of break it down and ask people, well, what are your ideological preferences, or do you tend to vote Republican or Democratic? You do see that there aren't a whole lot of true independents in the country anymore. You can really say about 85% of the population either leans Republican or Democratic. So third-party candidates can usually only try to carve out a niche in other areas. So I think at least in recent years, you haven't seen them talk a whole lot about race, but really focusing on other issues instead. If you think about Ralph Nader a couple of decades ago, instead they really try to perhaps shine a light on individual issues that they believe do not receive the attention that is warranted. And I think you can say that race and other issues receive a fair bit of attention. In general, I would say, if we move beyond race, third-party candidates will continue to face a very difficult time, even in today's day and age, which should be a somewhat promising environment for third-party candidates. Some people are sick and tired of this partisan rancor and disagreement, and people distrust the government. Because of the electoral system and a variety of other factors, third-party candidates really aren't able to get off the ground.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Adolf, once again for sharing your expertise. And I'd also like to thank our audience and students for informed questions. Before we close, I'd like to take a look ahead. Next week, our guest will be Dr. Alexander Görlach from the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. His talk is entitled Empathie oder Ressentiment, der Kampf ums Weiße Haus. It is hosted by the Bundeszentrale and presented in German as a live stream on the website of the Bundeszentrale. So this works a little bit different. But I hope you come see us again in a week. Be well and have a good night.